Okay, dope. All right. I think most people know who you are, but do you want to give a little background, and then we can rock and roll?
Yeah. So I just finished my PhD in rehabilitation sciences from Drexel in Philadelphia in April. My research focused on risk factors for injury in competitive swimmers. So that was the paper that we read for today's meeting is a paper written by my actual dissertation advisor from 2015. And some of the work that I did was for my dissertation or for my preliminary work to my dissertation was kind of following up on this research review that she did. And if you kind of notice that she talks about swimmers in a few different places. And so that was like the path that I went down with my research. I myself was a competitive swimmer in high school and college. So um, I found that population interesting. But yeah, so my research then and now focuses on risk factors for injury in athletes. I mostly am interested in like movement pattern or movement competency, movement quality, and core stability kind of gets lumped into there, as well as training load and some psychosocial stuff too. So that is me, and the paper I thought would be a good one for this week. Obviously, this month is shoulder, but the relationship between the core and the shoulder is often hypothesized based on some theories from the late 1990s and early 2000s. And I think that it's important to explore what the evidence is behind these theories. You know, when a theory comes out, like the kinetic chain theory, which we'll go into in more detail, it is sexy and it makes sense, and so people in the rehab and fitness worlds will flock to it and kind of, you know, oh, core stability, we're going to throw core stability at all of our patients and all of our athletes because we have this nice theory that all makes sense. But then as the more research comes out, it's important to take a step back and say, well, what is the evidence now that we've had time to test this theory? What does the evidence actually say, and how should that dictate the way that we are measuring core stability, prioritizing core stability in our training programs and our rehabilitation programs? So that's kind of the angle behind this.
Perfect. So do you want to format this? We just kind of go down section by section, or do you want to give kind of like your whole thoughts about it and then go from there? How do you?
Well, so I just pasted into the chat. I kind of have 9 broad topics that I think would be good to cover, and if we might not get to all of them, but I think that would be kind of a nice way to break it down, and it's similar to the order that the paper goes into. So I don't necessarily think I need to summarize the paper, but I think we can just talk about it as we go. So I think the first question that it would be nice to just get a general agreement on is the same question that the paper asks, which is, what is the core? And so I want to open it up to what the paper says the core is and whether we kind of agree with the definition that the paper puts forth. So first and foremost, what does the paper say how does the paper define the core?
It defines it as a commonly accepted definition is the bony skeleton, ligaments, and musculature of the lower spine, pelvis, hips, and proximal lower extremities. When considering overhead athletes, this definition has been expanded to include the bony skeleton, ligaments, and muscular of the shoulder girdle. So that's not general or broad at all.
Yeah. So I think that broad definition to me is kind of like a reaction to the people who, when you say core, they think abs or abs and obliques, right? But we're talking about like this whole region in the middle of the body that now the shoulder people are saying, well, it even includes the shoulder girdle. So when you go to the other extreme, it's like, well, everything is the core. Right? But to me, that I like this definition, that we're looking, low back, pelvis, hips, even the proximal lower extremity, and then you're thinking, well, okay, well, glutes, okay, that makes sense, and hamstrings. But then if you're like breaking it down, well, what's a lower body exercise and what's a core exercise when it comes to the glutes? Is it the intent? Is it the load? And so I think that's murky. But does anybody have a different definition that they like to think about, or is this what they kind of expected and how they usually think about it?
That's how I've used it. And, I mean, honestly, I thought it was odd that they had to throw in upper extremity injuries, because, I mean, if we're going to have the corollary of the hip is like the shoulder, that should automatically be part and parcel for part of that process, right? I mean, if we're going to include the hip, it's a cup rotation type of a joint that's part of force transmission from the legs through the upper extremities. Well, then how are we not going to include the shoulder automatically into that process?
Yeah, to me, it becomes odd when you say, okay, well, if the shoulder's included, then that means like the pecs are part of the core, right? And okay, so I'm doing bench press. Well, I'm getting my core training for the day. But I appreciate that idea that, well, if we're including the hip, then if we're thinking about the upper body, then of course it makes sense to include that joint, which is kind of like the upper extremity analogy to the hip, right?
Right. And how do we function? If I'm lifting a jug of milk, do I not have to function at that shoulder and be able to control that throughout our, what we'll call the kinetic chain here, right? I mean, do I not have to have that capacity? So to me, it's just part of what has to be part of that process if we're going outside of our quote unquote intrinsics within the trunk itself, right? So
yeah, well, that's another thing that they didn't even really get into in this, like there's that whole inner and outer core thing, and if they did, because they were focusing on the upper extremity, I think they didn't have to go there with these are the more superficial muscles, the more deep muscles. They didn't even really mention the individual muscles at all. Just kind of, these are the regions, and we're including any studies that looked at these general things.
right. And as was noted in the chat, I mean, really it's context specific. What is the function, as you were asking about? Is it a glute? Is it lower extremity? Or is it a core stability exercise if we're including those things? And in the chat, he said, wouldn't it be context specific? What is the function of that muscle at that point in time? Is it more this or that when we're looking at quote unquote core stability, which I think is a misnomer, but we'll get into that later.
Well, so that's the next thing I want to talk about. So the paper defines the core stability. I think it has a pretty broad definition, and this comes from the kinetic chain theory, but it's this idea that the core has to be able to control the trunk position in order to produce forces, transfer forces between the upper and lower body, control forces to and from the extremities. And then the thing that to me often gets often is not included is this idea that it's in response to perturbations. So that twofold, like, how are we measuring it in response to perturbations, and how are we training it in response to perturbations? So if the problem is, and we can get into this more, but we so often see endurance measures of the core, front plank, side plank, back extension hold, sit up hold, and they're done for time, maximum duration holds, and there's no element of perturbation. You're just trying to hold that position. And yeah, you have to have some awareness of where your body is in space to make sure that you're maintaining the proper alignment or the height of the plank or whatever. But those are static, and they're not encompassing as broad of a definition as what this is saying. So it's saying it's the neuromuscular elements. So it's not just endurance, but it's also strength. It's also neuromuscular control. It's also power, which nobody really even measures core power. So I'm not even sure why that. It's nice to think about, but I haven't really even seen that assessed. But they do mention it. And then the idea that within the neural component, you can look at control, you can look at proprioception, you can look at muscle timing. So it's this really broad definition, yet many of the studies that they cite are talking about it as side planks.
Do you think they went with that broad definition in both contexts of what the core is and what their core stability is, just so they could get enough studies? Because really, I was surprised that they got 6 and 11 that actually met their criteria. I thought we'd be looking at 2 and 3.
Yeah, well, I think I don't know what the process was for writing the paper, because I started the year after they published it. But me reading into it, the fact that and we'll talk about this, or I'd like to talk about this, the fact that they expanded the definition to include balance, which we do see often that people are conflating balance training with core training, and there might be a reason to do that, but we can talk about how that might be problematic. But it seems like they, with the inclusion of balance training, they probably needed to have a really broad definition so that they weren't reviewing 2 and 3 papers. So so why don't we actually talk about that now? So the idea of including balance training. So they looked at static balance and they looked at dynamic balance. Do you all know the difference between that terminology, or what types of tests would constitute one versus the other? Or can anybody define static balance, define dynamic balance, or give examples of tests, like a test in each category?
All right, I'll go. So static balance is a non-moving static position. And so in that, there's no actual movement that's happening. It's sort of like a maintaining of a posture or position. And then dynamic. So I guess, I mean, that could be just like standing on one foot for 30 seconds. And then an example for dynamic, I mean, you could get into like dynamic gait index and making sure that like someone is able to control or maintain a certain posture or position while moving through an activity.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought of the measures of dynamic balance and gait, but that's really, that would be a great example. The one that we see, or we will see and talk about in this paper, is the Y balance. That's kind of like the quintessential one. The way that, and I totally agree with your definitions. The way that I think about it from like a biomechanical standpoint is that when you're testing static balance, your proxy for that, if you were doing it in a lab, you would be standing on a force plate and you would measure the postural sway, which is just the excursion of the center of pressure over, let's say it's a single leg stance for 20 seconds. So that would be the way that you would measure it in a lab. If you were going to measure it clinically, you would probably do something like the balance error. You could do the balance error scoring system, which you would have somebody stand for 20 seconds in single leg stance, tandem stance, 2 legs on ground, on foam, and measure the number of times they come out of a testing position with their eyes closed. Or you could just do a single leg or like a stork test and see if they can hold it for 30 seconds or something like that. And then dynamic balance, like the Y balance, you're really testing the person's limits of stability. So if let's say they're standing on one leg as they would be in the Y balance, if you were to measure that in the lab, you might see how far they could lean forward and how far they could lean backward and side to side. So see how far they can take their center of pressure to the edge of their base of support, but then come back to center under control. And that's really what the Y balance is doing when you're having somebody push that indicator box or the star excursion and just reach on a line on the floor. How far you can go in any of 3 directions is testing your limit of stability. So then the question is, well, is that core? And I think well, yeah, let's open that question up. Are those tests core tests?
I feel like, I mean, what wouldn't be using your core, I guess, is like the thought process that like goes to me. It's like literally any context we could add, you could say yes. So yes, short answer. That's about it.
So yes, but basically we have there's two extremes. There's one where, well, everything is a core test, because if you're moving, your core has to be working the region from here to here has to be working to do all of those things. But then if you want to kind of tease out what the purpose of this paper, what's the relationship between the core and injury and the core and performance? Well, when you're measuring the core, you can't have this more general measurement, because you can't isolate the effect. So on the one hand, you can say, well, anything is core. On the other hand, you would want to measure the isolated effect of the core. So for example, there was one study that looked at, the paper didn't talk about it, but when I looked it up, they were comparing people with shoulder injuries and people without shoulder injuries, and they were doing side planks. But because the side plank, well, if you have a current shoulder injury, that could be painful. They had people like lying basically right on their shoulder with their feet elevated, so that they could take the influence of the upper extremity out. And I don't know, to me, I tried it, and if I had a shoulder injury, I think that would still hurt. But so the idea is like, okay, we have balance, let's say, and balance requires core. If you do put EMG sensors on those rectus abdominis or whatever muscles, you would see that those muscles are working. And so that then, like, I don't know, in the mid 2000 or the early 2000s, that launched that whole like, oh, we're gonna do a bunch of balance stuff, and that's gonna train the core, and we're gonna do a bunch of instability stuff, and that's gonna train the core, and that's gonna be great. But there are so many other components of those balance tests, right? Like your lower leg muscles have to be working properly. Your entire lower extremity, when you're doing a Y balance, like you're requiring quad strength, you're requiring hip abductor strength, you're requiring neuromuscular control of the lower extremity. So if you're doing a test like that, and then you're saying, okay, somebody performed poorly on the Y balance, and now we found an association between that and future injury, and we're going to say that that's because they had poor core stability, it's like, pump the brakes. Like, it could be any of those things. So yeah, you can test the Y balance, but you should test if you want to say that it's because of the core, then you should test more isolated measures of the core.
Travis, you brought it up, so I'm going to ask. You said neuromuscular control, and it was in this paper. Is there a good working definition of neuromuscular control?
Well, so the paper shows three. They say neuromuscular control, and then I don't know if that's neuromuscular, and control is a subcomponent of that, but at least there's proprioception, there's muscle timing. So I guess this paper didn't feel the need to operationally define it. And I off the top of my head don't know a good operational definition of it either. I know the way that Sylphie's measures it in her lab is with what she would consider the gold standard for measuring core neuromuscular control is that she has a metal chair with a solid hemisphere underneath of it, and that sits on top of a force plate. Maybe I can just pull up a picture, that'll probably be easier. And I'll share my screen. I lost it. Oh, here we go. So the setup that she uses for this is this metal chair with the hemisphere underneath of it. It sits on top of a force plate, and the person, it's fairly unstable. So if when you're trying to balance on it, it's pretty, it's not that easy, I guess, to fully tip it over, but it's also not that easy to stay perfectly still. And so she'll do various measurements with this. She'll just do like a static measurement. Okay, how still, you tell the person to stay as still as they can. And then you measure the center of pressure trace over time, distance traveled, velocity, all sorts of things. Then she'll have people lean in 8 different directions as far as they can and see how far they can go, staying like close enough to this line and then coming back to the center. And she'll also have people do well, actually that's kind of like so she has people do the limits of stability in all 3 directions, and then there's another test where there are dots a lot around they're looking at a screen which is showing their center of pressure trace in real time. And so she has people, they'll be in the center, and then they have to go out to a target and then come back. So that tests like accuracy and speed that you can acquire those targets. It's kind of a gamification. But so this is the long-winded way of saying that that's what she considers the gold standard in her research, and it's only really been applied to people with low back pain. But and one of the studies that I did early in my PhD training was comparing a bunch of clinical tests to that test, and we didn't really find anything. So, and we can talk about that later. So there's not really, but to answer your question, there's not really a gold standard. If there were a gold standard, this would be it for measuring core neuromuscular control. I don't know that there exactly is one. This is what is often used in the low back research from Sylphie's and a few of her other people, her collaborators. But so there's limitations with this biomechanical measure, and now nobody actually has. There are like 3 of these setups that exist in the world. So if you actually want to measure that in the clinic, well, how do you do that?
It seems like an arbitrary, like, how is that different from balance? Like that setup, and then what is not neuromuscular control?
Right. So everything is neuromuscular control, right?
Yeah, because in the paper it said, however, this may be attributed to the fact that only core muscle endurance was trained and not aspects of neuromuscular control. So how did they?
Yeah, and actually this was a conversation that I was having with her the other day as we were extracting. So we're working on a clinical practice guidelines for low back pain. We have like 200 papers where effects of exercise on low back pain. And so we've broken the exercise up into categories: general exercise, I guess, directional preference, motor control, whatever. And she was like, well, the issue with the motor control literature is that people are calling things motor control that actually aren't motor control. It's just like, I don't know. I think, and I know like next to nothing about motor learning, but I think there are certain requirements that you would have to call it a true motor control intervention. So, and I think with what we're doing, you kind of have to go off of, so to an extent, what the authors are saying, instead of like, I mean, if they're really like doing something that's actually has nothing to do with motor control, then I guess we could call it something else. But even within that area of research, they're calling things motor control that actually aren't motor control. So yeah. So all right, so we have our basic definition of core stability, or our very generic definition of core stability, which is maybe so broad so that we can actually have papers to review in this critical review. The next thing that we can talk about is the kinetic chain theory. So can anybody define the kinetic chain for me, or say what the importance of the kinetic chain would be in relation to athletic performance or injury?
I guess my like really basic understanding of the kinetic chain theory is like the idea that like a distal segment affects the proximal segments. That's all really that I would like guess.
Yeah, so exactly, it's that everything is connected. So there's a good graphic in the Kibler papers, kind of like, I think it's a baseball pitcher, and actually I can just pull it up because I think I have it right here. Yeah, so the original paper by Kibler showed this nice graphic of like the energy being transferred up from the ground, and it, you know, the sequence of a pitcher throwing the ball being released is the last thing, but everything, the energy is getting transferred from one component to the next component to the next component. So it's this idea that if there's a break or a leak in any of these, any joint, and in particular the core, then you're losing energy transfer that could eventually go into the ball to throw it really fast. So that can have ramifications from a performance standpoint because you're losing velocity potentially if you're lacking stability and that you're having some sort of leak through that system, or you could have repercussions from an injury standpoint because you're not controlling forces well through the lumbar spine, and that's causing some sort of compensatory pattern somewhere more distal. So that's kind of like the basis for this whole explosion of training interventions and injury prevention paradigms. Is we have to improve the fluidity of the kinetic chain so that we can improve our performance and mitigate injury risk.
How would we even be able to measure a break in the kinetic chain?
There actually are, you can do that type of analysis in a lab with force plates and motion capture. It's called like, what the heck's it called? You can actually calculate the influx and outflow of energy into and out of each segment. It's easier in the lower extremity. I've done some gait biomechanics for my master's degree, and so I looked at that a little bit in amputees. It gets more complicated when you're trying to take like information from a force plate and calculate it all the way up through like the ball being released at the hand. So I don't claim to be an expert at that, but there is research doing it, and I've seen it in tennis serves. Like I've stumbled across papers that are doing that. So at the very least, you can measure this flow of energy between segments. Whether you could actually say, well, there was a break in the chain at this spot, therefore, like I can't say that for sure.
Yeah, the optimal is the problem, right? What's optimal for each individual, right? So we can say, okay, this looks like it's not within what we think is normative, but the problem with the normative is we always regress to the middle, and these are high performers, right? So is that aberrant movement, quote unquote, actually what gives them the advantage to be that peak performer? We never know because we don't research peak performance. We research median or average, right? And so we always regress to that mean. We don't ever look at the optimal per se and see what that actually is.
Yeah, well, and it's hard to study elite athletes, and like you said, when we do studies, we're looking to get large sample sizes so we can make, you know, more confident conclusions. But maybe this would be a scenario where it would be interesting to do a case study on a high performer and try to figure out what's making them tick. And I think anecdotally, we can say we've looked at people, they have something wonky going on. We try to fix or correct that, and it makes their performance suffers, right? So that there's kind of the argument like, okay, Usain Bolt crosses his midline when he's sprinting, but so at the most simple level, we would say, well, if he could get more sagittal plane because he's going in sagittal plane, then he would be faster. Well, it's like, well, there might be reasons that he has a leg length discrepancy, so he needs to do this. He's figured out the optimal strategy that's going to optimize his performance, right? And it might not look like this perfect system. So the paper kind of talks about there's this section in the middle that talks about the lower extremity and the trunk, which I can only imagine was like a reviewer coming in and saying, well, you need to tell us about the lower extremity, because they don't mention anything about that in the introduction, and then it just gets thrown in there like, oh, we know this stuff about the lower extremity. So basically what that section says was that we know a little bit more about the relationship between the core and lower extremity injuries, especially knee injuries, and especially in females. And the reason for that is probably the prevalence of the injuries. So just from a standpoint of getting research funded or doing research, oftentimes we're trying to answer questions that are going to have the biggest impact, right? So if the paper gives some stats at the beginning about the prevalence of lower body injuries versus the prevalence of upper body injuries. And so you can kind of see like, okay, well, if we're trying to prevent injuries, we're mostly talking about non-contact injuries and overuse injuries, because contact injuries are very difficult to control for. But so now that we're into the non-contact injury mechanisms, well, upper extremity only makes up 20% of those. Oh, got a question in the chat. So is regional interdependence a related concept to the kinetic chain theory? I would say the answer to that is yes. The idea with regional interdependence is that the regional interdependence has also been talked about either pain or function. Like if you were thinking about pain, well, I might have shoulder pain, but that might be because of, some sort of instability at a neighboring joint. And so, yeah, it's the same concept of these linkages and energy not being transferred effectively through those systems. So anyway, are they both trash? They're hard to prove, right? Or they're hard to find direct evidence for. And I think this paper kind of shows that initially. But there's both a limited amount of research available, evidence available, and then within that evidence, it's very murky. But anyway, the reason that we are seeing so few papers in this, it's an important area, right? Because baseball players, volleyball players, swimmers are all getting injured. But if you look at the big injury problem, ACL injuries, lower body injuries, concussions. So that's why this body of evidence, even you would think, well, it's 2015, we should have answered this question already. And then you go and look at it and it's like, well, there's actually not that much there. So the next thing I want to ask you all is, what types of evidence would we need in order to justify doing injury prevention, core training for injury prevention, and core training for athletic performance?
I think we would need like an actual strong RCTs showing control groups not performing these core exercises, and then other groups and following them out during maybe their sporting season and seeing if there is a stronger prevalence of injury in the control group versus the intervention group. That's my thought process.
Yeah. So to me, that's the ultimate. If we could get an RCT, a controlled RCT with a large number of people in either looking at multiple sports or many RCTs looking at individual sports, we could really say, we could have direct evidence that this intervention is effective for this outcome, whether it's injury or whether it's athletic performance. But the way that the sequence of research usually goes is that we're not going to start with an RCT for something that we have no idea whether that could be a thing or not. RCTs are so expensive. They take a lot of time. So we often start with cross-sectional studies, right? And so this paper shows that it gives a lot of examples of cross-sectional studies. So what can anybody describe the design of a cross-sectional study and what sorts of questions that it could answer in relation to these two things? And then we'll talk about what the limitations of those are.
I feel like, is it not just taking like a snapshot of a particular group at one point in time, but I feel like the limitation with core research is the fact that, one, we don't necessarily have like a working definition of like core because it's very context specific. And so like, let's just say if we were just to look at the shoulder and then saying like the core muscles of the shoulder were like the rotator cuff and like your scapula stabilizers. So it's like, we'd have to look at like a study that's just looking at that particular one subject. And it's just like, to create more questions out of that is really difficult because it's like, who's to say these like baseball players aren't doing all these exercises and they're who's not. And so I think we have to get really specific, like by specific region that we want to test of the core to even go from there, if that makes sense. Kind of what I'm saying.
Right. So just to piggyback off of that, the cross-sectional study is a snapshot in time. So you could look at, if we're talking about injury, you might have a group of injured athletes and you have some definition of injury that is like homogeneous enough. And then you would have controls, and hopefully the controls are matched on other potential things that could affect the core or affect the outcome. So if you want to compare, you could look at core stability in injured athletes and uninjured athletes. And you might find that the injured athletes have impaired core stability compared to the uninjured athletes. And so the first thing that you might want to say is, well, these people, this impaired core stability must have caused their injuries, right? But because it's only one snapshot in time, you can't determine whether the impairment occurred before the injury or it actually happened as a result of the injury. So they got injured, they stopped training, and their core stability, plummeted because they just haven't been doing anything. And now you measure them at this later time point, and it's actually the reverse of the causal relationship that you're wanting to demonstrate. Like Nicholas said, the challenge with these tests these studies even further is that there are so many variables that in order to match the participants, you have to really think about all of the things that could be affecting these outcomes so that your participants, the comparison is well controlled and there's not any sort of confounding variable. So, right, so let's say now that we've done a cross-sectional study and we've either shown that people with upper extremity injuries perform worse on our core stability measure than our people without injuries, or we show that we show some sort of correlation in a snapshot in time between people with better core stability and athletic performance. So maybe that means that they hold a side plank for longer and they jump higher, or so that's kind of like a functional test, the vertical jump. Maybe it's actually a true measure of sports performance. Like one of the papers in here was on baseball players, and they looked at it was a different study design, but they looked at how many walks the pitcher, how many batters the pitcher had walked, and how many innings they pitched. So you could look at something within the sport. But anyway, so once we've established that, okay, there is some cross-sectional evidence for this, now that gives us some momentum where we would say, okay, if we want to demonstrate a causal relationship, we have to do this study prospectively, like Joey asked in the chat. So the prospective design will measure somebody at one point in time and then follow them over maybe it's an athletic season, and then you can say they had this quality. They had you break them up into people with you measure core stability, side plank, and you say, okay, they held the side plank for more than 45 seconds or less than 45 seconds, and then look to see whether that was associated with injury over the course of the season. So that can give you some more information about the temporality of when the deficits are occurring and then when the injuries are happening. So you can say, okay, that deficit or that impairment in core stability actually preceded the injury. But then, and then to Chris's point, if you wanted to know that core stability better core stability is associated with improved athletic performance, you would have to do an RCT. But you wouldn't just right off the bat do an RCT, which is why I think this paper by Silfi's only mentioned one or a couple RCTs. They're hard to do. They take a long time, a lot of manpower, a lot of people. And you want to do all these preliminary cross-sectional and prospective designs before wasting your time on something that you know nothing about potentially. So that's why we have so few RCTs, because there are earlier steps in the process. But in order to actually answer the question, we need RCTs. But then, go ahead, Chris.
Couldn't this also be like, they could be measuring like an arbitrary thing? Like, let's say they're looking at swimmers and they're measuring core stability, and the ones who got injured had weaker core. What if they just arbitrarily like also measured like leg press or like a mile run, and all those groups also had like lower numbers there? Isn't it just like a random like test that could just be a coincidence? Or those individuals who are injured, they in general are maybe have less like resilience or weaker, and any test would potentially be lower.
Well, so there are two problems when you do the research like this. So oftentimes and some of the studies that were cited in this paper, they'll just measure a laundry list of things. And then they'll say, well, the side plank on the right side in the athletes who were 11 to 13 years old showed an impairment, therefore core stability is a risk factor. Well, one, it was a cross-sectional study. Two, it wasn't shown in either of the other age groups that you studied. Three, it was only the one side. So when you do so many comparisons statistically, you are bound to you are increasing your risk of finding something that's not actually there. So that's number one. And then number two, when you do those types of studies, you should look at the association between all of your tests, because maybe two of your tests are capturing the same underlying quality. And so that would kind of be a way of teasing that out, like, oh, the side plank and the front plank, or I guess you said like the side plank and the leg press, if they're 100% correlated, then and they wouldn't be, but if they were perfectly correlated, then they're measuring the same thing. And so you would want to kind of tease that out before you made a bunch of conclusions. Like just looking at the interrelationships of your risk factors to the outcome. So I think that pretty much covers the types of study designs and what we would want to see. So the initial premise was, okay, a lot of people are doing core stability training for injury prevention and performance enhancement. In order to really justify this, we would need these types of studies, this type of evidence. Oh, and then the other thing with the RCT, right? So you want to show that a core stability intervention improves athletic performance or decreases the risk of injury. Well, then you need a specific core stability intervention. But all of the interventions that we ever see, except for this one that they mentioned in this paper, are multi-component. FIFA 11, all the other stuff, like you're not just gonna do your core training. And ethically, I don't think it's really fair to do just core training, because you know that all of these other components are necessary. So then if you want to tease out, well, what's the effect of core, then maybe you do strength training versus strength training plus core training versus control. But you're still like the group that gets this extra thing is bound to do better, just because that's like the A versus A plus B. When you add the B, it just tends to do better. And it might not mean that core training is the thing. So it's hard to isolate the effects of core training if you look across intervention studies, because And the problem is that even in this paper and in the papers that it cites, they're saying core training improved this, this, and this. But they might not have even done core training because they might have been doing balance training. Two, they might have done core training with all these other things. So that to just say, well, it was the core training caused our improvements in resilience or athletic performance it's very difficult to conclude.
Well, also, Travis, what is core training? Do we have an operating definition of that? Because when I'm doing a squat, is my core not getting worked if I'm doing anything else, right? So how are we able to isolate the core from other exercises that we're actually able to do?
Right. So there's isolated core training. If that's really a thing, you're never not isolating one muscle, but you might be isolating spinal flexion, right? And then there's integrated core training: squats, deadlifts, pull-ups, push-ups, bench, maybe not so much bench press, but overhead press. These exercises are definitely eliciting at least high EMG activity of those muscles, whether or not that actually transfers to improved core stability. So we have to define core stability. We have to figure out how we're going to measure it. We have to figure out what our intervention is that's going to target that, and then we have to figure out if the intervention actually improved the things that we were trying to improve, and then whether it actually improved athletic performance and injury.
Right. And then do we have the correlation of this exercise improves this specific component of performance? Because if we're looking at broad performance, we're going to wash out any kind of potential gain in this one area that we may be looking at, right? I mean, because we've got all these areas. Are they faster? Are they stronger? Are they more powerful? Are they able to cut faster? Are they able to? There's so many areas of performance. Which one are we looking at that this is supposed to do? And then why would we use a static anti-flexion, extension, or rotation exercise in a dynamic environment, right? Without external perturbations, without all that stuff. The design doesn't even tell us that we're going to get where we want as far as looking at true athletic performance.
Yeah, and so that was when I started this process a few years ago, and I looked at this body of research. I thought, all they're doing is side planks and front planks and back extension holds. I wouldn't expect any of those things to reduce injuries or improve athletic performance because they don't look anything like the qualities that are needed. So that got me thinking, well, okay, this neuromuscular control piece must be it. But then when you explore that, well, you just realize that even if you were able to find an intervention that improved worked on neuromuscular control, and you were actually able to measure it and improve it, athletic performance and injury are still multifactorial. So, and we'll talk about this towards the end, but are you majoring in the minors if you're trying to work on these things when there are bigger fish to fry from, things that are going to contribute even more to these two outcomes, improved performance and decreased injury risk, that we should be focusing on as opposed to
sleep?
Yeah.
Yeah, Travis, you had highlighted it in the paper of past injury and what was the other one? Or the biggest,
making sure your previous injuries are fully rehabilitated.
Right. Way bigger rocks.
Yeah. And the interesting thing that this paper does mention is the kinetic chain is kind of supposed to be this proxy for that. So if you have a break in linkage, well, maybe it's because you've had a previous injury. And so that's where it's there is some of this stuff overlapping, but do you need to measure core stability, or can you just ask if they've had a previous injury? Then you don't, that's the easiest thing to do, is have them fill out a questionnaire. You don't even need, it doesn't even take any of the researcher's time, and it gives us the best information about the person as opposed to doing this elaborate screening thing on them.
Right. And it seems to hold for almost all regions. Prior injury in that region means that you're more likely to have one in that region again, right? And potentially in multiple regions again.
Right. Yeah. And so, that gets to the question of, are you more injury prone, or are you just more injury prone, or is there some sort of regional interdependence that if your right hip is, you had a previous right hip injury, that means your left shoulder.
Right. Or do they have a poor diet? They're not sleeping. They don't recover. They don't do all the other things that affect it as well. Right. Yeah. I mean, lifestyle can come into that as well.
Yeah. So let's just go through then and talk a little bit about what the actual evidence was for the relationship between the core stability measures and upper extremity injury. So what evidence did they find? Or what tests did they find that might be useful for looking at this in athletes? There were 4 tests that they talked about, 2 of which we've already sort of said, well, or no, I guess 5 tests, 2 of which we've said these are balance tests. Yes, they're working the core, but we are not going to necessarily be able to isolate the core as the reason that they perform poorly in this test. So there was a single leg balance test that they found was associated with non-contact shoulder pain. The study was by Radwan, but when I looked at it, it was only their right leg and not their left leg. So I kind of ditched that one. There was the Y balance and UCL tears in high school and college baseball players. So that's a nice finding. Y balance, there's some evidence for that, but I'm not ready to say, I'm not ready to say that that's a core stability thing that's causing their issue with that. I just think the performance on that is too multifactorial. So there were 3 other tests that they mentioned. One of them was by Chowdhury, one of them was by Pontillo, and one of them was Tate.
Was the Chowdhury one the single leg raise task?
Yeah. So they had people stand on one leg. They had a digital inclinometer. I think it was like an iPhone app, and they were tracking their excursion of their pelvis in the sagittal plane. And so I think they established some sort of cutoff, and they showed that people who had greater excursions, that was indicative of less lumbopelvic control. And there was an association between poor performance on that and injury in professional baseball players. Big sample size. They looked at just general injuries, but in baseball, 60% of the injuries in that paper were shoulder or elbow. So it's a fair enough comparison, or fair enough to include that here, even though it wasn't strictly upper extremity injuries. So I think that's one of the best pieces of evidence that we have out of this whole paper, out of this whole dialogue. And to me, that is an interesting test. I think it has some face validity that is actually measuring something about the stability of the lumbopelvic region. And it's reasonably clinically viable. I guess you would need their app, but you don't need anything fancier than an inclinometer and maybe an app to do the test. Yet, this group, Chowdhury, they had this paper with injury, and then they also had a paper that we'll talk about with performance. Yet I looked, and it doesn't seem like they've used this test again, which made me wonder, like, all right, this was a pretty good chunk of evidence in a pretty large population of people. Why has this not been studied further? And I don't have the answer to that.
It was also a little less arbitrary because it was for pitchers, and it was like almost the beginning of a pitching position.
Yeah, right. So this is a very specific movement to pitchers, because that's the initiation of their throwing motion. And it's only like the first 3 inches that they were having the person raise the leg. But that's the kinetic chain theory, right? If something is wonky right at the beginning of the motion, especially like in that, as you're lifting the leg off the ground and trying to coordinate through the core, through the lumbopelvic region and into the throw, they found that people were more at risk for injury.
Are you going to send people down the rabbit hole of now we got to get the whole little core exercises again and no pelvic motion and all that other shit? I mean, that's
yeah. So right. So what you do with that information? Well, okay, now we've identified this as a risk factor. The next thing in that step should be an intervention study where we're trying to improve the people's lumbopelvic control. And then we have to see if it actually improved their lumbopelvic control and see if it actually decreased injuries compared to a control group, or at least compared to the previous study, number of injuries. And they haven't done that. It would be pretty difficult to do that. So that's kind of where we're at with this, is like, okay, we know this is a thing, but we don't know if we can fix it. We don't know if we can improve it. We don't know if improving it helps anything. So it's still like, that's as far along as we are. The other two tests were the closed kinetic chain upper extremity stability test, which you're in a wide push-up and you're alternately touching your hands. And then the other one was the side plank, which I did the side. Let's just throw the side plank out right now, because they looked at it in three different age groups, and they only found it in one age group. They did 1 million comparisons. I don't find that to be a particularly compelling finding. But let's talk about the closed kinetic chain upper extremity stability test. So the name of that test has upper extremity stability in it, yet we're talking about core stability, right? And okay, we've mentioned, well, the shoulder girdle is a part of the core. And if you do the test, you do feel like there's some sort of, and to do the test really well, there's some sort of anti-rotation component going on in the truncal region. But as with the Y balance, I'm not so sure that that is an isolated enough measure of core stability to say that to call it an impairment in core stability increases the risk of injuries in football players.
We used a similar test when I was at my prior clinic utilizing force plates. Sparta Science has a large database, right? And they've correlated certain things. And actually this test, the version on their force plates, actually picks up adductor strains in soccer players better than it does any upper extremity injury.
Yeah. Well, so then maybe there is something to that.
I mean, again, for an argument for it potentially being core, but it's not necessarily telling us that upper extremity closed kinetic chain is telling me anything about the upper extremity. It's just telling me about how the body in general may be coordinating motions, right?
Yeah. So, and it's like another instance where the core seems to be doing something with the lower body, because we're seeing these adductor things, but and yeah, so that's a good piece of research in college football players, Division I. So a good population to draw this off of, and it's there's a nice clinical conclusion, or there's a nice clinical rule that we can say, okay, their study showed that if you're doing fewer than 21 touches across 2 trials of 15 seconds of this test, then you're more at risk for injury. I forget what the odds ratio or the relative risk was, but it was reasonable. It wasn't like a really small effect. So we want clinical tests, right? We want tests that we can do quickly in the clinic with little equipment that can tell us something about somebody's risk of injury. Now, this is only in college football players. You wouldn't necessarily, so you could only say, if you had a college football player, you could do this test with them. If it's not a college football player, 21 is probably not going to be the number. We also have no evidence of an association in other sports. So it's still there. Now we've talked about all of the pieces of evidence for this relationship between these two things that everybody talks about, and you can boil it down to like 2 tests that are very limited in scope. So we have limited quantity of research. They didn't even, in this paper, it was a critical review, it wasn't a systematic review, so the requirements for that are a little bit more lenient in terms of, like in a systematic review, you would go through all of your included tests, or all your included papers, and you would rank the quality of that evidence. They didn't do that here, so without actually reading all of those papers, we don't know, were these high quality designs? Were they at risk of bias? We don't know. And because a couple of them were cross-sectional, we already talked about the limitations of cross-sectional research in terms of not being able to state with much certainty that the temporality of these deficits were preceding the injury. And maybe the issue with this is just the tests that they've done, right? So maybe they're not measuring core stability. If maybe core stability or core neuromuscular control or some element of that is a risk factor for injury, but no study has measured it in the correct way. We just don't know. So the next thing that we can talk about is the relationship with performance. And what were your all's thoughts, like comparing the evidence that they presented for performance compared to the evidence that they presented for injury? Did you find this to be a little bit more compelling, or kind of the same, like, meh?
I for sure was more in the meh category, especially with like the what they call it, the DLLT, that double leg lowering test, and then it's
Has
like,
anybody done that test before, or done like either themselves or on a patient? It's actually, I actually really like that test. So you're on your back, you're in supine with your legs up at 90 degrees. You have a blood pressure cuff underneath the small of your low back. It's kind of, Sarman has like a whole sequence of things that you're kind of doing in that position. But you lower your legs slow. You set the reading on the blood pressure cuff. You inflate it to 40 millimeters of mercury, and then you have the person lower slowly. You have a digital inclinometer on their thigh, and you look at the reading on the blood pressure cuff, and it dips. If it dips above 50 or below 30, so plus or minus 10 on the 40, it's usually below because people's backs are arching off of it. That you have them pause and you measure their thigh angle. So the idea is if you can lower your legs closer to the floor, you have not only control and proprioception of your lumbopelvic region in space, because you're able to watch that dial at the same time. You're able to control that dial, that fine tune, but you also need a ton of strength to keep your back pressed into that blood pressure cuff as you're lowering your legs. So it's kind of finicky to set up the test, and it's hard to teach people to do it. Like if they're just doing it for the first time, a lot of people struggle with it. But it is a nice objective measure of something. Like we intuitively know, okay, your rectus abdominis and your anterior core maintains posterior pelvic tilt and keeps your lumbar spine kind of flat. We know that might be important because you don't want to like dynamically flail out. And here's a nice way to measure that. All you need is a blood pressure cuff. So, sorry, Kevin, go ahead. What were you going to say about the test?
Oh, I was just gonna finish it off. That like, especially like the 40-yard dash, especially in comparison to that DLLT like test, for me, it almost seemed a little too like extrapolated. I don't know,
Yeah.
like it. I don't know. So just like tying that like, I guess stability, neuromuscular control of performing that task to like these positive outcomes, it's like, I don't know. I thought it was just kind of a reach, and I'm not quite sure.
Yeah,
how I
it's
feel
hard
about
to
it.
see exactly how that would translate to that particular or any of the measures that they looked at. It's kind of more of like this global measure, like, okay, we know you have a strong core, and now we think that somehow that's going to help you with these things that we think you also need a strong core in, even though the test doesn't look much at all like the parameters of athletic performance that we're looking
To your point of the performance aspect, they looked at, there was that one RCT with the junior tennis players, but it's like what you said, there was improvement, but they had strength training on top of core muscle exercises, and it improved surface velocity. So you don't know like what it was.
at. Yeah, I put no stock in that, right? Well, you can put stock in, okay, we know that an intervention with strength training and core training works. So if you took out the core training or you took out the strength training, you wouldn't know. So you're probably going to use them together. And I think ultimately that's what we would all conclude, and we'll talk about that at the end. But even in that, with the limited evidence that we have, are we ready to not do any core training because of what we see here? I don't know. Maybe we can talk about that. But I think, yeah, the bottom line with the performance stuff is it's kind of similar to the injury stuff, is that there are pieces, there there are correlations oftentimes between endurance, measures of endurance, like the front plank or side plank, with various measures of athletic performance. They're almost all cross-sectional. So we can't necessarily say that if we improve core stability, or we can't say that impaired core stability is causing poor performance. We can't say that if we improve core stability, we're necessarily going to improve performance. We need intervention studies, but intervention studies are hard, and it would be maybe unethical potentially to do an intervention study and only address the core, or at least who would be willing to participate in a study like that? Like, okay, you can't do any other training right now. You're an in-season athlete, but you can't do any other training right now because we can only train the core. So go ahead.
Do you think there's any utility to like anti-rotation or stability exercises that like the strength and conditioning world loves to use, like farmer's carries, pow-off press, dead bugs, like very kind of low level things where you're controlling like the axial skeleton, but like obviously it's not doing harm, but what is the purpose of it? And you can't, like, it's hard to progressively load or like have some type of movement in the positive direction. Normally those things are kind of like circular in regards to, you're always kind of using like the same time or the same load, and it's not really like, I don't know, in my, like from my perspective, it seems like they added on at the end, but is it just fluff that doesn't need to be there?
Yeah, and I think that's really hard to conclude. So two issues, right? Like one, if you're doing planks or crawling or something, it's hard to progressive overload that. So you can do it for a longer duration. You could squeeze everything harder. But there are exercises, pow-off press or farmer's carry or suitcase carry, like a one-arm farmer's carry, that they do have a higher loading potential. So there are ways to progressive overload that. For the exercises that there are not progressive loads, or the only way to progressive overload it is time, and somebody's already doing a 3-minute plank. Well, even with that, I guess you can add weight. Like say crawling, I don't know. It's going to be more of probably a warm-up exercise. I mean, depending on the person, right? If somebody has a hard time crawling and it's fatiguing them, or they're having trouble coordinating the opposite arm and the leg. But once you get to a certain point with that, is it fluff? Is it, okay, it's good for a warm-up, but it's not eliciting any real training stimulus? And I think it depends on the athlete too. Like, does this quality that we're training, can we see how this is going to translate over to the sport or the target activity? So,
you can't say any one exercise, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's no one bad, good. It's contextual. What is the reason? What are we doing it? Is it in the early stage rehab? Is it late stage performance? And what is our use and our intent? There's no bad exercise, just like there's really no good exercise. This exercise may be the best exercise in the world, but if you're in a rehab and can't handle a load, it's breaking you down and not doing any good. The context matters, and when we're applying, why we're trying to do that. So just looking at any one thing and saying, oh, that's not good, I think is just missing the boat.
Yeah, but is it majoring in the minors, right? Like if we have time with an athlete to do 8 exercises in a session, and we're spending, I don't know, 2 of those exercises on core training, should we, like I isolated core training, let's say, should we be allocating that time to doing something else, given that there is so little evidence for this stuff? So I guess the question is, right, how much time should we prioritize in light of the findings of this critical review? Are people over prioritizing core, or how much should we prioritize it?
Again, in isolation, or as on top of and integrated in within the exercises, or right? I mean, because if it's leading to, okay, we're going to do this, and then we're moving to this, and we're moving to this, and we're moving up a progressive active chain leading to whatever goal that individual has, then there's a context where it might work. But if they're already at point Z and we're still at point A trying to give them those exercises, we're not getting any training effect, right? We're not getting anything. So it's really, what is the intent, and are we at a level or a dose that's allowing us to have training effect? I would argue that when a person's already in the weight room lifting and doing things like that, a lot of these things are somewhat moot, right? Unless we're getting into an anti-rotation and none of their other lifting has any of that kind of stuff. And so we're creating a novel stimuli to them. We're really not giving a training stimuli in most of these other cases. So yes, we're pissing in the wind as far as that goes. But it really is, what are we trying to accomplish with the individual? And that should drive the decision for whatever exercise, whether it be a very regressed exercise or very progressed exercise. It's what are we trying to do and what's the context in which we're applying it.
Yeah. And I think the hard thing too is like, that all makes sense. But then the narrative, like, well, are we going to improve your athletic performance with this? And it's like, well, no one thing is going to improve your athletic performance. It's all of it. Are we decreasing your injury risk? Well, again, it's not one thing. It's everything that we're doing in the.
Yeah, I was going to ask you at the end if you felt like you were tilting windmills, right? I mean, if we're looking at injury prevention or athletic performance improvement, because the multivariate component of that is, okay, so I can make a pitcher better by standing on one leg. What does that do for the third baseman? Right? Do I just have each individual position now has to have its own exercises, right? And to what degree, right? Or do we just allow the athlete to play the sport? We get the base building blocks underneath, and then they play the sport, and that provides the training stimulus for the sport's performance improvement, right? So where do you fall in that?
Well, so there's like the position specificity there. There's sport specificity, there's position specificity, and there's individual athlete specificity. And I kind of, it depends on your setting, right? If the resources that you have are only such that everybody has to do the same thing, because either just for so many logistics reasons, then you do that. If you can get a little bit more position specific, because pitchers' needs are different from catchers' needs, which are different from outfielders' needs. I think we all agree, well, you should be there should be some degree of sports specificity if you're training large groups of people. That's another conversation, I guess, because everybody can basically do the same thing. But there's some that we're going to tweak the parameters of that to match whatever the sport is. But you can get into the weeds of, well, we've assessed this person that they, based on their demands of their sport, their position, and their individual strengths and weaknesses, we've identified that they need to be able to stand on one leg better because they're poor at that, and that's a risk factor for injury. So I think, but we know that when we apply interventions more broadly, we are more successful, because if we just measure them and find that they are impaired or not impaired on this, well, we could still have false positives and false negatives from the test. So it's better to just have everybody do the Nordics and have everybody do the Copenhagens and have everybody do the single leg balance, I guess, if you think that's going to be relevant with the pelvic, whatever. So I don't know.
Okay, that's fair. I mean, it's a standing kind of argument in the world, right? And as we've moved to more specific training and stuff, and we've got athletes stronger and faster and better, we also have higher injury risks, right? We have not been driving those down with our interventions.
The injury data in college sports has been stagnant. It stayed the same for 15 years. So even though we feel like we've made all of these enhancements in technology and in training interventions, it's not changing that stuff. So I guess right now my stance is let's give people generally the same training interventions, and then maybe we get specific with a few of the things that we're doing from a core standpoint or from a whatever standpoint for the position or for the individual based on what they're presenting. But if we know that Nordics and Copenhagens work, let's have everybody do Nordics and Copenhagens, So then the other thing that I want to tackle off of this, and the paper didn't really address it, but is the core special in that it needs this anti-movement training or this stability training, or could you just do dynamic exercises like we do for the rest of the body, and you'll have, so if you imagine a hypothetical intervention study of one group that does anti-movements, you have another group that does dynamic movements, and you have another group that does control, and you measure their performance at the end and their injuries, is one of them going to be better than the other? Like why is the core trained isometrically but we're not training isometric biceps or isometric pecs.
Yeah, Travis, this was kind of like, I threw it in the chat, and this is kind of what I was thinking, like when I typed that out, like any of these like broader, just general, you know, I'm just gonna say non-core specific exercises, like still have an impact on like, I guess, core stability, because that is such like a broad term anyway. So it's like, it's already impacting those. So who's to say, I don't know. I'm like going to squat, it, even just body weight squat, is like using those muscles, and like it is technically like a perturbation. So and so I'm more in favor of maybe not specifically looking at like core stability exercises, just based off of like how it's been laid out through this paper. Like, does that make sense? I don't know. I'm not quite sure where I'm at with, I don't know, is what I'm trying to say.
Well, what's interesting is like the core gets talked about as this magical thing, and I think maybe we're finding that it might not be so magical, but also my simplified answer is that just like you might isolate any muscle and integrate any muscle, like, okay, we're going to do biceps or we're going to do pull-ups. Well, it doesn't have to be one or the other. Let's do both. We can do our full body exercises, squats, pull-ups, push-ups, overhead press, deadlift, and that's going to train the core. And then we could also do some isolated stuff if we wanted to, and we had the time, and it was relevant to that athlete, sport, position, and their individual areas that they need to improve. But it's probably not like the conclusion, I think it was the Reed paper that Silphy cited. It said isolated core training shouldn't be the primary emphasis of performance enhancement programs. Like, that's obvious, but I don't know, maybe there are people out there who think that the core is like the number one thing. Well, maybe a Pilates instructor, right? They might say like, well, everything originates from the core, so we're going to get really, really strong in the core and everything else is going to work itself out. And now this athlete's going to go be great. I think we can probably say that that's not the best approach, right?
Well, how much of this, Travis, do you think is floor and ceiling effect, right? We have a ceiling effect for how much more strength we're going to get out of the core really matters. But we know if I sever T1 and you don't have a core, you ain't doing shit, right? I mean, so there's a definite minimal level that we have to have. So where is that living between the floor and the ceiling that we need to know, and is that relevant if we can go beyond that ceiling, right?
Right. So the best example that we always hear all the time is like the front plank, right? You can hold a front plank for, and I don't know what the real minimum threshold is, but if you can hold it for 30 seconds, that's pretty good. If you can hold it for 60 seconds, you're probably fine. If you can hold it for 2 minutes, there's no point doing any further front plank training, right? Like you mean
that 8-hour world record was meaningless?
I've watched some of those and I marvel at those guys. It's nuts. I mean, it's just crazy, but now you're talking about like that's your sport, right? I know it's a joke, but like, yeah. So right. So we have all of these qualities that we need to train. How much, and this is true with anything. How much strength is enough? How much core strength? How much core endurance is enough? And you can only answer that question in the context of the individual in front of you, which makes it hard to make generalizations. The one other thing, so this is what Chris just posted in the chat. I think that this is a big limitation in this area of research and why this paper, even though maybe it was overly general and didn't really help us reach any strong conclusions, but it does point out that the terminology is just all out of whack, because people are talking, even this paper messed it up a couple times. She talks about core strength, but she means the tests were all endurance. And yeah, you need some amount of strength to be able to do a good front plank, right? But So are we talking about core strength? Or are we talking about core endurance? And then are we talking about core stability, or is core stability a bullshit word for what we really mean is we should be more specific and say core endurance or core strength, or if it's a neuromuscular control thing, say neuromuscular control. So I feel like that there's such an overemphasis in the literature on measuring endurance. There was a 1999 paper by McGill that you'll see cited everywhere in this literature that it was just norms for side plank, back extension, and sit-up hold, and they called it, I guess they called it stability. I can't remember. Maybe they just called it endurance. But now all of these papers are saying we measured core stability and they just measured endurance. So if we're agreeing that core stability is this multifactorial thing, and then we just measure endurance and we don't find a relationship, have we really said that core stability is not important, or are we not measuring it in the right way? And it's hard to measure. We don't have a good way of measuring it in the lab, really, or an agreed upon way of measuring it in the lab. We definitely don't have a good way of measuring it like the neuromuscular control aspect clinically. There are studies that are coming out. I've been trying to publish one for like 4 years, looking at, we did a test where we did a cross-sectional study with people who had ACL injuries and matched controls, and we had them sitting on a fitter board, so that one of those wobble boards that you usually use to stand on. But it was very similar to that biomechanical test, but we kind of did it like the balance error scoring system. We just had them see how long they could hold it or how many mistakes they made over 30 seconds. We found that people with ACL injuries performed worse. And, we don't know, did the core stability, if we're calling that core stability or core control or core proprioception, did that precede the injury or not? We don't know. But we can at least say that they're not, when we're measuring them at 3 and 6 months post-op, they have not restored their core stability compared to healthy matched controls. So that's something that maybe does need to be focused on more in a rehab context, because ACL injured athletes are suffering re-injuries at such a high rate. And we think that this core thing is important among so many other things. I mean, which we talked about a few months ago during the ACL month. But we hardly talked about the core, I feel like, during that month. And coming from my bias, where I originally thought the core was really important. Maybe I don't think it is as important now after delving into it, but it's not really talked about in that literature hardly at all. And so the bottom line to me is like, okay, we don't have strong, people are doing this, have been doing this for a long time, are going to continue to do it. There's not really good evidence, but I don't know that the absence of evidence is evidence of absence. I think that there are still additional measures that could be taken to, firm up this evidence, more studies, better ways of measuring that would really help answer this question. If it's not important, let's put it to bed. If it is important, but the reason that we haven't found it is because we haven't been measuring it correctly, let's try to figure that out.
Travis, I have a question. Do you think that if we are focusing, so like even amongst like clinicians and future clinicians, we're having trouble like deciding like the solid definition of core, and really like we kind of go back and forth on a lot of this. Do you think it potentially becomes nocivic in the sense of like when we're having conversations with patients about core, that they like, let's just use like a low back pain patient. It's like now they're focusing so much on that when maybe there were some majors they could have focused on. If you could touch on that a little.
Yeah, so I think that's super important. And I think especially in light of what we realize that we don't know is that, well, static posture is ridiculous, right? Don't look at somebody and say, the reason, you're standing with anterior pelvic tilt, you have a weak core, that's the cause of your back pain. Like, we all know not to do that. But so you have to measure it, right? You have to do some sort of test, whatever it is. Maybe you decide that you like the closed kinetic chain upper extremity stability test. Maybe you like the double leg lowering. Maybe if my study ever gets published, you like the seated balance test on the fitter board. But you shouldn't just like kind of watch them move and say, well, first of all, you shouldn't watch them move and say you have a weak core. Because you haven't measured it. Second of all, if you do measure it and you do find that they are below well below the norm for people in their demographic. Well, so what? We don't have that strong evidence that says that this is a real problem. It could be a problem. If people are in pain, there's a reason that they're in pain. Working on this could help them, but it's probably going to be part of a multifactorial thing. So the narrative is really important, right? So, oh, you can't hold a side plank? Oh my God, your core stability is awful. We've just figured out the root cause of your back pain. So then, well, okay, we improved their ability to hold a plank, and they still have back pain. Well, we were wrong. We look like an idiot. We should have realized that this whole thing was multifactorial. Or worse, maybe the pain gets better, right? And then they have another episode and they think, oh, it's my posture again. Or, oh, it's because I haven't been doing my side planks, when it's really something, or the confluence of other factors. So being really careful about, and especially with the core and low back pain, there's so much of there's so much mythology surrounding it, or over interpretation and extrapolation of that stuff that has then been, I think the reason that we see some of this, in addition to the kinetic chain theory, is the Hodges muscle timing thing, the instability. So we needed to create stability when your vertebrae really aren't unstable. Something needs to be pretty wrong for that to be the case, right? So just like you said, Nicholas, let's not put too much stock in this, and especially to the point where we're creating a nocebo.
Travis, what about, maybe we get more specific to the shoulder? We're going through the shoulder in our cohort, or in our class right now, and there's a ton of talk about shoulder impingement, shoulder instability, and it's what the fuck is shoulder instability, and how would you even test that versus a stable versus unstable shoulder, unless it's someone who's chronically dislocating or subluxating?
Yeah.
Do you think there's any merit towards creating more stability within the shoulder, and is there more evidence behind that than core stability?
I think I guess my first answer is I don't know, but my second answer would be it makes sense that there would be, just because now we're talking about the same site as if we're worried about shoulder injuries, or if we're trying to think about shoulder injuries, it makes sense that the range of motion, the strength, and the proprioception, or the actual, that this is a joint where we can actually have instability, right? Or there is, you have people who dislocate, or you have people who have apprehension when you take them into one of those special tests. So I think that you could make the case that shoulder stability is more important for shoulder injuries than, if you said, well, I can only do, in this hypothetical example, I can only do one set of exercises with somebody. Am I going to focus on their core, or am I going to focus on their shoulder? And of course, I guess it depends how they present. If their shoulder stability is already good, then however you're testing that, and their core is really jacked up, then all right, maybe we do focus on the core. But if you were just applying an intervention to everybody and you wanted to prevent shoulder injuries, to me, you would go to the direct thing and do the shoulder stuff. Do you have more thoughts on that?
Me?
Yeah.
No. I hate the terminology that's being used in class. It's just thrown around between a lax shoulder and then an unstable shoulder, and then a shoulder that's being impinged. And
yeah, well, all of those terms are problematic, right? So
yeah.
So ligamentous laxity is one thing, or you have hypermobility, your shoulders just go all over the place. Okay, I think we can talk about that, and that's a thing, right? Shoulder impingement. Now we're moving away from that term, because that's kind of a normal thing, especially when we're talking to people about whatever pain they're having. That's kind of okay. When you raise your arm up over your head, this space gets smaller. So, and these things move together. So, you know, sometimes that's sensitized, and that can be temporary, and we can do these things to alleviate that. But you're not like destined for pain forever, and you're not going to have. Hopefully, this isn't going to develop into a chronic thing. And I don't know how they're presenting that. Like in your program, are they still talking about like impingement, or have they moved a little bit away? Like what's the pulse?
Kevin or Nick, do you all want to take this? I think Kevin fucking moves out of this. Nick, you got it.
Yeah, that's kind of what I think the idea our program is at the moment is going through. It's like the idea of that shoulder impingement is kind of like we've kind of grouped it in, like obviously there's like the NEARS classification, and then we have like group 1, 2, 3, 4, or like primary versus secondary impingement, whether or not someone's hypermobile, whether that be related to instability, so leading to secondary impingement. Kind of those are kind of like the baseline, I think, like assumptions that we're making for essentially all shoulder like conditions, like in the absence of like an extreme trauma.
And besides the special tests where you're Hawkins, Kennedy, NEARS, whatever, what kind of tests are they showing you for instability?
At the moment, I'm trying to think. I don't even know.
None.
Do y'all know if we
it's
have
almost,
any that we've?
It's like assumed that if it's not frozen shoulder, if it's not rotator cuff tear, I think impingement is like, and well, I asked our professor, I was like, how is this different than like, because it's such a broad category, why can't we just describe it as like multifactorial shoulder pain or non-specific? Like, because we just went over the neck, and he was like, yeah, I'm okay if you use like non-specific neck pain. And so the shoulder is just like, it seems way too overly complicated. And then to like bucket it as impingement, and then to have like 4 classifications.
Yeah, why do you have to settle on this exact diagnosis and try to find the particular biomechanical culprit when there are all these structures? And then does it even matter because somebody's shoulder hurts here? We're going to do exercises for their shoulder and their T-spine and their neck. And like, why? I guess for insurance billing purposes, you have to have diagnosed it. But
yeah, and I think and our professors have even mentioned like the idea of like a lot of the times like getting into the specifics is more so for our own like thought process, and it's not even like it's not going to change our plan of care. And so like because of that, like it's more so just like, well, we understand a lot of these special tests like reliability, validity, are they not super great? So it's more so for you just to understand. And he's also mentioned like the idea of like they may ask you some of the stuff on the boards.
I was just going to say that like they have to teach you it because it's going to be on the boards. But yeah, if you look at, there's Piggott put out a paper in, I don't know, 2016 about the, I think it was Piggott, and I think it was at least his group. Chad Cook maybe was on the papers too. But looking at the reliability and validity maybe of some of these tests, and like they're horrible. Like you want high sensitivity and specificity for these things, and they're all over the place, and it gives you no confidence that you should even be using any of those tests. Yet, you know, maybe there's still a reason to do the tests to figure out what provokes a patient's pain, so that then you can avoid those things in the short term, and then, you know, expose them to those things in the more intermediate term. But as far as like settling on the diagnosis between all those things, and the accuracy of what they mean and how important or they're probably not that important for telling the patient, unless the patient's one of those types of patients that says, well, just tell me what's wrong, doc. You know, I have to know. But that, you know, that person, that's going to be somebody who might need some education about, you know, it's not just one thing, and just because I think that this structure is implicated doesn't mean that this is going to be forever. Or
Did you see
discussion could be had on imaging as well, right? I mean, incidental findings of this, that, and the other, and people we know that are asymptomatic, right? So, I mean, do we really know we can maybe correlate a test to that image and say, okay, maybe that is, but what does that do to our treatment? Really, testing should be guiding what we're going to be doing. Can we turn it on? Can we turn it off? That tells me it's mechanical, right? And then what do I need to do to try to progress your load tolerance and decrease the sensitivity of the tissues? I mean, really, it's not overly complicated. It's not easy, but it's not, it doesn't have to be overly complicated.
It's interesting, Chris, that that was the non-specific thing was okay for the neck, but the shoulder, they're wanting you to be more pinpointed.
I feel like he's not super dogmatic about it, but it's like we're being taught this like shoulder impingement classification scheme from like a 90s paper that I don't know if it's going to be on the boards, but it's a very arbitrary way for us to kind of have these baseline assumptions of.
Is this particular professor like a shoulder guy?
No, he's just an orthopedic. He's like a freaking, he got his board certification in electromyography or nerve conduction testing.
ECS, yep.
Yeah.
I thought maybe like, well, this guy, his pet joint is the shoulder, so he's gonna go into tremendous detail on that, and he doesn't give a crap about the neck, so you can just,
Yeah, and I will say too, like I do think like he definitely has like told us as well, like it doesn't truly matter, but I think almost sometimes like appease maybe, I don't know, maybe some people in class that are like really trying to figure it out and have not been introduced to the narrative of like other options or multifactorial, like because those things are not necessarily talked about. I think that's kind of where
it's
like maybe some of the narrative is brought into.
That's like the next level, right? Like if you're starting out, it's easier to explain things as this causes this structure, this thing that we can identify, and it kind of has to be a little bit black and white at first and to test, and then after that you can get into the nuance of, well, the more recent research is talking about how subacromial impingement or impingement is maybe a term that we are moving away from, or we don't need to get as detailed with these diagnoses because it doesn't matter or whatever. So that was pretty much it. Oh, the one other thing that I wanted to mention about the paper, and I think we mentioned earlier, like the goal of their paper was to look at this relationship in athletes, and they did their best to, target or boil it down to just the papers that were talking about athletes, although the one systematic review by Reed, I think, mentioned that it was active adults, not just athletes. So I to my knowledge, there is not a study that has looked at this in recreationally active people or non-athletes. I don't think that they would find that many studies. I think this stuff is mostly relevant to athletes. There was one 2019 study that it was by Cope, and Chris and I had talked about looking at that paper. I felt like they came to even fewer conclusions than this paper did, even 4 years later, which isn't really, it's kind of unfortunate that in the 4 year in between that we haven't gotten any farther than where we're at with this. And that paper, they kind of restricted it to a few different sports. They didn't include swimmers, and I'm not sure why, because they were talking about overhead athletes, but I guess they, for whatever reason, decided that swimmers are not overhead athletes. But the point is that if you are not, what we've been talking about is largely in relation to the evidence around athletes. And so if you were working with somebody who's not an athlete, then you should be careful about extrapolating these findings to other populations.
Well, so there's really nothing that changes your thoughts on it since when you initially read the paper a long time ago till now.
Okay, so 2016, when I started my PhD and I read this paper, I thought, oh, the problem is that we don't have good enough testing for neuromuscular control. And so I went down this rabbit hole of, okay, I'm going to compare a bunch of different clinical tests I looked at side planks. I looked at that seated balance test. I looked at the double leg lowering. I looked at the FMS trunk stability push-up, and a one leg hip bridge for time. I said, I'm going to compare these things to this laboratory gold standard that we have with the metal chair on the hemisphere on the force plate. And I'm going to say, I'm going to look at the correlation. I'm going to find, I'm hoping this like seated balance test on this fitter board is well correlated with this biomechanical measure. And then I can say that we now have a clinical test for this, and we can use this clinical test in a prospective study. And what I found was that there was no correlation between the fitter test and that, like nada. The two tests that did show some correlation were the one leg hip bridge and the double leg lowering. So I think that those two tests, so single leg hip bridge, you would be bridge your hips up with two legs and then extend one leg and hold for time, trying to, keep your hips up and avoid rotation of the hips. So there's some research on that test with lower back pain. And I mentioned the double leg. Well, I told you how to do the double leg lowering. There's maybe a little bit of research on that one as well. But so at the time I was thinking, okay, well, we just need to get better at measuring neuromuscular control. So I'm going to find these tests that measure neuromuscular control, and then I'm going to look at these tests in relation to athletes. And so I included some of the tests in my dissertation with swimmers, didn't find anything. The one thing that I did find that I probably won't even publish was that the closed kinetic chain upper extremity stability test, I did 16 like FMS style tests and beyond FMS. And the only one that was correlated with athletic performance was the closed kinetic chain upper extremity stability test, which is kind of makes sense for swimmers, right? Like you're using, swimming is an upper body driven sport. You need to have stable or propulsive. When you do that CKCUST really fast, it almost becomes like an upper body plyo. Like you're powering off one hand over to the other hand. So I have a little bit of an inkling that I think that that's a decent test in that population. But to answer your question, I was really gung-ho about looking at neuromuscular control. And as I've walked it through over the years, I've kind of realized that probably, well, one, we don't know, neuromuscular control is hard to measure, and we don't really have a good way of doing it clinically. Even that seated balance test, which we found differences between the ACLs and the controls, like that takes 10 minutes to do. I don't know how many clinicians are going to want to spend 10 minutes of the time that they have with a patient doing it. So I'm sort of, I guess I'm more disillusioned now. I thought like, oh, there's this gap. We're not measuring neuromuscular control. That's the thing. That's going to be the gold ticket. And then I better understood that it's just hard to isolate one thing and say that that's the root cause of anything. So I've become more cynical about it. But at the same time, I'm not ready to, like in my personal training business, I'm not ready to not give people core exercises because of the lack of evidence. So I'm kind of waiting and watching.
Also, like Gen Pop fucking love ab exercises. So
that's the other thing too. Yeah, when you're in a rehab context or a personal training context, people want to feel their abs working because they believe in spot reduction, or they just like the feeling of their those muscles working. So giving people a combination of what they want with what you think they need. And oftentimes, in your motivational interview with somebody, they say, oh yeah, I have a weak core. And you say, well, how do you know that? And they say, well, my PT told me. I say, well, how did they measure it? And they say, I don't know. But I give them core exercises anyway, because that's what they want. And like Chris said, there's no downside to doing any of those exercises. It just might not be the best use of your time. But also, for me, the exercise selection the core stuff can definitely be integrated with the multi-joint stuff just by doing an offloaded squat. So squat with one kettlebell instead of two. Now you're balancing out that lateral flexion. A push up with a rotation at the top. Now you're getting some rotation. A push up with a shoulder touch at one time. You're getting, or like just anything asymmetrical. Like you can weave these aspects in into the training. And then if you want to give somebody a couple of more isolated exercises because they like it, or they like, maybe they have an aspiration to do a front lever or a human flag or some sort of party trick that requires exceptional core strength beyond what you would normally need. Like, those are some reasons why you might focus on this more. But generally speaking, maybe it doesn't need to be emphasized as much as it has been in many of these populations, especially given that we're basing it off of this theory that has no support and may not be that testable.
Boom. Thanks, man.
Thank you.
That's 2 hours. Crushed it. And then next week, we're going to have Sam Spinelli talking about shoulder impingement.
Did he pick out the paper yet?
He sent, oh, geez. I think he had, let me see. I wonder if he's right on. Hold on. Yeah, it's going to be, oh no, he chose 3. Michener, 2013, supraspinatus tendon and subacromial space parameters measured on ultrasonography imaging and subacromial impingement syndrome. And then he did, what else? Tucker, 2011, anatomical validity of the Hawkins-Kennedy test. And then 2015, staged approach for rehab classification on shoulder disorders, the STAR shoulder. And
got
then
our work cut out for us.
Yeah. And then Paul Salam is going to do his editorial, and then I think another paper for shoulder special tests on week 4. So it's going to be a freaking party. But Thanksgiving.
I'm glad that those will be more shoulder specific, because I feel like this was only tangentially related, but still.
It's fine. Yeah. It was a nice break from last week's super nihilistic frozen shoulder where it's chaotic. I was reading a paper after that, and there was a timeline of like there are patients like 20 years later that still have limited range from frozen shoulder. So I was like, okay, well, that's reassuring. But all right. Yeah. Thanks everyone for joining the party. I recorded this. I'm trying to set up a Patreon to upload these things. I really don't know how. So I'm going to spend the rest of my Saturday figuring that out.
You don't want to give people that link to the Google Drive?
No, I'm for sure going to set it up and make it more formalized. Especially knowing that like that Google Drive is going to go away in a year and a half because I won't have that storage. Like that's my university's. So I want like a long-term place to store things. I could upload them to YouTube, but maybe I will. We'll see.
You know, I like Quinn for the clinical athlete one, he houses them somewhere.
Yeah, on YouTube. Well, actually on a drive and then uploads them to YouTube and then yeah. So I could do that for sure. I got options. But sweet. Okay. Thanks y'all again. Enjoy your weekend. Thanks again, Travis. Are you going to do more of the low back pain stuff this weekend?
I got the email from the advisor. She's like, where is it? So today's the day. I thought she would give us at least a week. I was like, election link was last week. Cut us some slack. But yeah, the email was last night, like late. She's like, I want it now.
Is your name going to be on the paper?
No, I'll get an acknowledgement. The problem, like for the exercise section, there's 10 of us working with my advisor to extract the data. There's also a manual therapy section and a behavioral section. So when you think about how many people are going to be involved, like you're not going to have 30 authors on this paper. So it sucks though, because we've all put so much time into it, not to actually be able to put it on our, whatever. I mean, I can put it on my resume, I guess, but
yeah. Wow.
Just a little asterisk in the bottom in the fine print.
For sure. All right, dope. Okay. Thank you all again.
Thanks, guys. See ya.